Picture this. A young man stands in the darkness of a Maryland night, his heart pounding so hard he's certain it will give him away. Every shadow could be a slave catcher. Every sound could mean capture, torture, or death. He carries no weapons, no money, only forged papers and a desperate dream of freedom. This is 1838, and this young man's name is Frederick Douglass. But that's not the name he was born with. That's not the name his enslaver gave him. That name, Frederick Douglass, is the name of a free man, a name he would choose for himself, a name that would become synonymous with resistance, with eloquence, with an unwavering demand for human dignity. Tonight, we're going to walk through the life of one of the most remarkable Americans who ever lived, a man who taught himself to read when it was a crime, a man who fought back when resistance meant death, a man who escaped slavery and then spent his life ensuring the world would never forget what he'd endured. This is not a story of passive suffering. This is a story of transformation, of a boy who was treated as property becoming a man who would shake the very foundations of a nation built on bondage. This is the story of Frederick Douglass. Frederick Bailey, that was his birth name, entered this world in February of 1818 on Maryland's eastern shore. But the exact date? He never knew. That might seem like a small thing, but it wasn't. Enslaved people were deliberately kept ignorant of their own birthdays, their own ages. It was a way to strip away identity, to reduce human beings to livestock. His mother's name was Harriet Bailey, but Frederick barely knew her. She was hired out to a plantation 12 miles away, and the separation was intentional. Slaveholders understood that the bond between mother and child was powerful, dangerous even. Love made people want to protect each other. Love made people willing to risk everything. So Harriet would walk those 12 miles at night after a full day of brutal labor just to see her son, just to hold him for a few hours before walking back in the darkness to be ready for the next day's work. Frederick would wake in the night to find her beside him, and in the morning she'd be gone. She died when he was 7 years old. He wasn't told until after she was buried. He felt neither grief nor connection. How could he? You can't mourn a mother you never really knew. And that was exactly the point. That was the design. His father? The man who enslaved them? Almost certainly. It was never confirmed, never acknowledged, but Frederick knew. Everyone knew. This was the horror of slavery. It turned fathers into masters, half-brothers into property. He spent his early years on the plantation of his mother's enslaver, Colonel Edward Lloyd. It was a massive operation, a kingdom of cruelty, with hundreds of enslaved people working the fields. Frederick was too young for field work, so he ran errands, watched over yards, endured the cold and hunger. There was never enough to eat, never enough clothes. Children ran around nearly naked, their feet cracking and bleeding in the winter cold. They ate cornmeal mush from a trough, like animals, scooping it with oyster shells or pieces of wood. There were no plates, no spoons, nothing that might acknowledge their humanity. He watched people whipped until their backs were ribbons of flesh. He saw men and women worked until they collapsed. He learned young that his life had no value beyond his labor, that his body belonged to someone else, that his pain was entertainment. But something was forming inside young Frederick, something that the system of slavery worked desperately to destroy, a sense of self, a growing awareness that what was happening to him was wrong, not natural, not divinely ordained, wrong. When Frederick was about 7 or 8 years old, he was sent to Baltimore to serve the Auld family, Hugh Auld and his wife Sophia. This moment would change everything. Baltimore was a city. It was different from the plantation, and Sophia Auld had never owned slaves before. She didn't yet know the rules. She didn't yet understand that kindness toward enslaved people was considered dangerous. So, when young Frederick expressed curiosity about the newspapers she was reading, she did something remarkable. She started teaching him the alphabet. Can you imagine that moment? The first time letters became sounds, sounds became words, words became meaning. It was like a door opening in a wall he didn't know existed. But Hugh Auld found out, and he was furious. He forbade his wife from continuing the lessons, and he explained exactly why, in words that Frederick never forgot. Learning to read, Auld said, would make Frederick unfit for slavery. It would make him discontented. It would make him unhappy. It would ruin him as a slave. And in that moment, Frederick understood something profound. The same thing that would ruin him as a slave would make him a man. Education wasn't just knowledge, it was power. It was the pathway from bondage to freedom. From that moment forward, Frederick became obsessed with learning to read. He would trick white children in the neighborhood into teaching him, turning reading lessons into games. He would trade his food rations for reading lessons. He would copy letters from ship timber at the docks. Every scrap of writing became a textbook. He got his hands on a book called The Columbian Orator. It was a collection of speeches and essays about freedom, democracy, and human rights. One piece in particular struck him, a dialogue between a master and a slave, where the slave argues so eloquently for his freedom that the master releases him. Reading this, something crystallized in Frederick's mind. He found the words to describe his condition. He found the arguments that proved slavery was evil. But it came with a terrible price. The more he understood, the more tormented he became. Ignorance had been a kind of mercy, and now that mercy was gone. He could see the full horror of his situation. He was trapped, owned, and now he knew exactly what that meant. He would spend hours by the Chesapeake Bay, watching the ships sail freely, and he would speak to them in his mind. You are freedom's swift-winged angels. You are free. I am a slave. Why should you be free while I am bound? At age 15, Frederick was sent to Edward Covey, a man with a reputation as a slave breaker. Covey was hired to break the spirits of difficult slaves, to turn resistant human beings into obedient tools. Covey worked Frederick like an animal, before dawn until after dark, every single day. He would hide in the bushes and jump out to catch Frederick resting, then beat him for laziness. He was constantly watching, constantly punishing, constantly reinforcing that Frederick had no control over his own body. For 6 months, Frederick endured. He was beaten so regularly that the scars formed layers. His spirit began to dim. He started to forget what it felt like to be human. He was becoming exactly what Covey wanted, broken. Then came the turning point. One August morning in 1834, Frederick collapsed while working in the scorching heat. The sun was merciless, and he was sick, possibly with heat stroke. He fell to the ground, unable to rise. Covey kicked him, ordered him up. When Frederick couldn't stand, Covey beat him in the head with a wooden slat, leaving him bleeding in the dirt. Frederick made a decision. He ran 7 miles through the woods to find Thomas Auld, his legal enslaver, to beg for help, for protection, for mercy. Auld listened to his story and sent him back to Covey, back to certain punishment. When Frederick returned, Covey tried to tie him up for a whipping, and something inside Frederick snapped. Not broke, the opposite of broke. Something fused together, hardened, became unbreakable. He fought back. For 2 hours, Frederick Douglass and Edward Covey fought, the slave breaker and the teenager, and Frederick was winning. He didn't strike Covey, didn't attack him. That would have meant death. But he defended himself. He resisted. He refused to be tied, refused to submit. Covey called for help from other enslaved people, but they pretended not to understand his orders. They watched Frederick resist, and they did nothing to stop him. Finally, exhausted and humiliated, Covey gave up, and he never touched Frederick again. He never even reported the incident, because to do so would mean admitting that a teenage slave had bested him. Frederick would later write that this fight was the turning point of his life as a slave. It rekindled his desire for freedom. It proved that his spirit couldn't be broken. He was still a slave in body, but in his mind he had already declared independence. "I was nothing before," he would remember. "I was a man now." Frederick was eventually sent back to Baltimore, hired out to work in the shipyards. He learned to caulk ships, a skilled trade, and for the first time he was earning wages, significant wages, $6 to $9 a week, substantial money in the 1830s. But he never saw it. Every penny went to Hugh Auld. Frederick performed the labor, earned the money, and handed it over to a man who owned him. This arrangement clarified something for Frederick. He wasn't enslaved because he was incapable of taking care of himself. He wasn't enslaved because he needed a master's guidance. He was enslaved because slavery was profitable. His labor created wealth that other people enjoyed. That was the entire system, and he decided it had to end. He planned an escape with several other enslaved men, but the plan was discovered. They were arrested, jailed, and nearly sold to the Deep South, a fate considered worse than death. But Auld intervened, returning Frederick to Baltimore instead. Frederick didn't give up. He planned again, and this time he told no one except the woman he loved, Anna Murray, a free black woman who worked as a domestic servant. On September 3, 1838, Frederick Bailey put on a sailor's uniform, borrowed papers from a free black seaman, and boarded a train heading north. His heart must have been thundering. Any white person could challenge him. Any mistake would mean capture. He made it to the train, made it through the ticket check. The conductor barely glanced at his papers. At one point, a man who knew Frederick got on the train, and Frederick hid his face, certain he'd be recognized. 24 hours of pure terror. Every stop could be his last moment of freedom. But he made it. To New York City. To freedom. He was 20 years old, and for the first time in his life, he owned himself. Anna joined him shortly after. They married immediately and moved to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where Frederick took a new surname, Douglass, inspired by a character in a poem by Sir Walter Scott. He was no longer Frederick Bailey, the slave. He was Frederick Douglass, a free man. But Frederick Douglass didn't escape slavery just to live quietly. He couldn't. Not when millions remained in bondage. Not when the nation pretended that slavery was anything other than a moral catastrophe. In 1841, just 3 years after his escape, Douglass attended an anti-slavery convention in Nantucket. He was asked to speak about his experiences. He was nervous, uncertain, afraid. But when he began to talk, something extraordinary happened. The audience was transfixed. Here was a man who had been enslaved, standing before them, articulate, powerful, undeniable. He destroyed every racist myth about black inferiority simply by existing, by speaking, by thinking. The abolitionists recognized immediately that they had found something rare, a voice that could change minds, that could make slavery real for people who wanted to look away. Douglass became a lecturer for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. He traveled the country, speaking to crowds that sometimes numbered in the thousands. He faced violence. Mobs attacked him, broke his hand, threatened his life. But he never stopped. In 1845, he published his autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. It became a bestseller, translated into multiple languages, read across the world. It put a human face on slavery. It made ignoring the horror impossible. But publishing the book was dangerous. It included names, places, details that could be used to recapture him. So Douglass fled to Europe for 2 years, lecturing in Ireland and England, where supporters eventually purchased his freedom. Think about that. A man who had escaped slavery became so influential that people paid to legally free him, just so he could return to America and continue fighting. Douglass went on to become a newspaper publisher, a presidential advisor, a diplomat. He advised Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. He fought for the rights of black soldiers. He championed women's suffrage. He refused to let America forget its sins or shirk its obligations. He lived to see slavery abolished, lived to see black men gain the right to vote. But he also witnessed the betrayal of Reconstruction, the rise of Jim Crow, the continuation of racial terror in new forms. And until his death in 1895, at the age of 77, Frederick Douglass never stopped speaking truth, never stopped demanding justice, never stopped insisting that America live up to its stated ideals. Frederick Douglass was born into a system designed to destroy him, to erase his humanity, to convince him that he was property, not a person. But he refused. He learned when learning was forbidden. He resisted when resistance meant death. He escaped when escape seemed impossible. And then he spent his life ensuring that the world would hear the truth. His story isn't just history. It's a reminder that systems of oppression rely on silence, on people accepting what they're told, on victims believing they deserve their suffering. And it's a reminder that one voice, speaking truth, can shake the foundations of injustice. Frederick Douglass started as property. He became a prophet, and his words still echo today, challenging us to build a world where freedom isn't a privilege for some, but a reality for all. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share. There are so many more stories to tell, so many voices that need to be heard. Until next time.